This one little thing, this one enormous thing, when I was reading for this in the early 200s, I wrote in 2003, seemed to me beating with a sort of wildness that you don't often get when you're reading history. And that these men were lost in that week. I mean, apart from anything else, it explained instantly the anger of a lot of the women in Dublin, these very mothers Tom referenced there, when the rebels when they surrendered, and there was abuse of the rebels by some of the women of Dublin. But how could it have been otherwise when you consider this event? And what sort of mother would you be if you didn't get a bit annoyed about it? With your heart broken. Anyway, I'll read it, and much to your horror, I'll sing 3 lines of a very complicated song, which is almost unimaginably complicated until the last 10 or 20 years when people have been trying to put our history back into its sweeter lines, you might say. Restore this magnificent, peculiar, thrilling, complex tapestry that we have as a national story. I wish the Queen of England would send for me in time and place me in some regiment, all in my youth and prime, and I fight for Ireland's glory from the clear daylight till the dawn. And then I will be able for to plough the rocks of Bourne. Although Willie might be hard put to describe to Christy Moran what happened in Dublin, it was harder nonetheless to get it out of his head. That boy from Cork, Jesse Corwin, should have been weeping was bad enough, but the young man dying had shocked him, shifted his very heart about, though he had seen 100 deaths and more, and he was hoping that Christy Moran would have a cool perspective on the matter. The curious part of it was that not many of the other Irish lads were talking about it. The news hadn't really filtered through, Willie supposed, and maybe it would be considered a little enough thing in the general mayhem of the war. The fuckers, was the Sergeant Major's first judgment. What the fuck are they doing causing mayhem at home when we're out here fucking risking our fucking lives for them? I don't know, I don't, said Willie. It seems to me a terrible thing, just a bad, dark thing. And how does the thing stand now? I don't know. They were holed up all over Dublin and firing out at the soldiers and us firing in at them. The place was a... And he couldn't really describe to the Sergeant Major what Mount Street was like. He couldn't. Well, Jesus, they're going to get short shrift from the fucking mothers of Dublin, let me tell you, Willie. And what the fuck do they want anyway? To be kings of Dublin or what? I don't know. Fucking carry on with them. It will all blow over, mark my words. Anyway, Willie, did you happen to get a bet on all sorts while you were there, like, said the Sergeant Major. Why, Sergeant? Because he's after winning the Grand National, the cup. Did you back him, Sarge? I did not. Well, I didn't back him, but I know a fella that did, said Willie happily. But that's good, said Christy Moran nobly. At least some lucky bastard was thinking straight. This day they were to go up to Hulluch, and it was the Wednesday, but there was no day of the week holy at the war, even Easter week. News leaked through that the rebels were being shelled from gunboats on the Liffey, and when Captain Sheridan announced this, as the men were lined up 4 by 4 for the route march, most of the men, even the ones that came in from the volunteers like Jesse Corwin, and some might have taken pause at the news and maybe dropped a tear, let out a cheer. You see, Willie, said the Sergeant Major just nearby. You see, Willie. All right, men, called the captain. Come on, then. And they went on up to Hull. It was evening time now, and they were in their new trenches. They had come up there in the darkness and they didn't really know how things were thereabouts, except of course there was a deal of firing and all the usual noises. The men were just talking as they always did, and they'd had a decent enough supper, those scamps. Willie was sitting in a corner of the trench where there was a tiny niche cut by some thoughtful person. It was a chance anyway to write to his father. Belgium, 26th of April, 1916. Dear Papa, how are you getting on in the midst of all? Are you all well and safe? I hope you will write and tell me. I saw the turmoil in Dublin for myself just as I was coming away. I hope very much you will be taking care and watching out. The men here are very scornful of the whole business. We have heard that the Huns put up a placard opposite the trenches of the Munsters. It said there was fire and ruin in Dublin and that the British were killing their wives and children back home. Well, the Munsters didn't think much of that, so they all sang God Save the King, and last night, I believe it was, or the night before, they crept over in the dark and got that placard. My sergeant major said a lot of those fellows are out and out volunteers and fervent home rulers, and he would not have expected them to know the words of God Save the King, let alone sing it to the Bosch. I am praying that you and the girls are all right. What good times we had when we were all small. Why I say that I don't know. There's not a man in Ireland that has served Ireland better than you. No one will ever know how much it has cost you. I am thinking of the ordinary days, going about the castle yards with you in the evenings. Mark my words, you have brought us through like a proper father. If Dolly had no mother, she had a father as good as any mother could have been, I do believe. So please write first chance and tell me what has been going on, your loving son Will. After stand to next morning and a daybreak like a row of sparkling dinner knives, a strange slate grey light mixed with sunlight that sneaked up through the ragged woods, Captain Sheridan read out a communication from headquarters to the effect that a gas attack was suspected imminently. Well, that was how they put it anyhow, but the colonel came by later and put it more plainly. They were going to try to drive them out like rats, he said, and indeed, the Welsh boys they had relieved last night told of hundreds of dying rats coming into their trench one day during their tour of duty, and it was sore suspected that some gas must have leaked from their canisters wherever the Boche were set up and ready. They came in, those rats-like fellas, expecting to be helped, but the Cardiff lads that were there clubbed them to death as best they could with the rifle butts. So that was another kind of enemy. The colonel was not Irish, and it was remembered at headquarters that the Irish ran from the first attack at St. Julian all those months ago. Willie and his companions had been issued long since with what were said to be the finest of gas masks. Yokes that went over your head, a kind of bag with a queer nose and two big eye holes, like something the Irish white boys might have donned when they crept out upon the countryside to burn hayricks and generally molest the landlords. They certainly gave a ghostly, menacing look to the men wearing them, but the wearer did not feel either ghostly or menacing. His cheeks got hotter and hotter, and dirty sweat burned down into his eyes. But the colonel stressed the need to stand firm, and he said he knew his lads would do so and not be letting the terror get the better of them again. This word, again, did not appeal to his listeners. Everyone knew how many were lost at St. Julian, and even if some of the listeners were newer men and never had been there in that hellish place, in the hellish time in the first place, no man relished a little bit of ironic talk just before what promised to be a nasty stretch. To counter this, those that were inclined, and there were many, nearly all, went down on their knees with Father Buckley and had a quick prayer. The sentries, of course, merely bowed their heads slightly, still keeping a weather eye on the mirrors that reflected the empty ground before them. Because they were in trenches which by necessity zigzagged every 100 feet or so, Father Buckley was invisible to everyone, except where he himself was kneeling. But the 1,200 men in the battalion, nevertheless, by some peculiar inner knowledge, knelt or bowed their heads, and a murmur of words rose up to the skies. Willie Dunn hoped God could hear them. Father Buckley said the Our Father, a few Hail Marys, and kept himself short. He didn't attempt to talk or warming homily, because no one could hear him except the nearest 20 men. Suddenly the enemy guns opened their filthy cursing mouths and belched forth a ruinous misery of shells. The men heard shrapnel searing about in every direction, and the biggest bombs were being dropped, it seemed, into the support trenches a good way behind. But the men didn't drop a stitch of the Hail Mary. They were halfway through knitting, one soothing word to the next. Then mysteriously every man knew Father Buckley was done. Perhaps it was achieved by a seamless series of Chinese whispers or Chinese winks and nods anyway, but it was a remarkable thing, Willie thought, a remarkable thing. Of course, any fool knew it was bad news when the Padre came right into the trenches. If they'd been on proper orders, they might have gathered in a field somewhere in the reserve lines and had a decent mass of it and a sermon from his nibs. It wasn't that he was unwelcome. He was well known because he showed his face everywhere. And though he was a bit strange and apart in some ways, the men liked him as they would perhaps the beloved aunt. If there was such a thing as a fearless, womanish man, he was it, for he was gentle and spoke soft with a lettered accent. There were round bits in his words where the men had sharp, and sharp when they had round, though indeed he didn't talk like a gentleman as such. It was whispered that he'd been found in private weeping, and yet he'd been seen in a dozen battlefields tending to the dying with a dry eye and a murmuring word. A drink of rum he always refused, but he smoked woodbines with everyone, and a woodbine was his calling card to a new Manian. Religion as such he rarely discussed, and sins or the like were not his constant song, though you could go to him for confession should you so have chosen, and he would give you the stiffest penance he could within the reason of the war. He advised chastity all right, but only because a dose of the clap was a fearsome embarrassment to a young man. Willie supposed Father Buckley was a man who had seen every type of wound the war could offer close up, because he had held every type of wounded man in his arms. He must have whispered last rites to headless men, and also to men with only a head left and the rest blown into a billion drops of air. He had surely felt the warm, ballooning armfuls of entrails spill into his own lap, and strained not to lie to any dying man, to steady him and ready him for the off, like a flighty horse in the stalls before a race. Certainly he believed a man's soul would issue forth like a dove, and fly up to its dovecot in the high realms of heaven. He told the men that their guardian angels had come back to them from childhood, and were with them again, watching over them silently and lovingly. He had endured those that screamed in terror, and those that screamed in self-pity, those that said generous last words, which might indeed be the memories that made him cry later. He had heard the sudden heart change that might rescue a man from the yawning pits of perdition. And indeed he had disappeared a few weeks back, and 'twas said also whispers that he'd been given a week's furlough at home because his nerves were tottering. But you would have to expect that. A man, especially a priest, could not witness scenes like unto the end of the world, as if the armies of the West had joined battle with the armies of the East in that wild apocalypse shown to poor St. John in his penal servitude under the Romans on the island of Patmos in that vanished world, and so on, without disturbing a few hairs on the head of his mental ease. Be that as it may, Willie knew and everyone else knew without saying a word or exchanging a look that things would be of a harsh enough nature because Father Buckley had elected to be with them. The gas sirens went off suddenly, and Willie nearly left the sanctuary of his pelt. O'Hara beside him jumped like a dog. He was trying to prevent it, but that cold, unfriendly terror flooded instantly into his brain. A sweat incongruously chilly formed in his hair under the helmet. Everyone struggled to don the wretched gas masks. Now, if these were the finest masks in creation, they were a bloody muddle to get on, and there was always the fear you might be missing a little place where the poison might seep in. Captain Sheridan came up cursing from his dugout with Christy Moran looking like storybook monsters. But they all looked like storybook monsters. The sergeant carried a canvas bag of trench weapons, more like the weapons of medieval times than anything else. Sticks with nails in them, rough cast things with iron knobs, and he was handing these out. Willie was given a thing like an Indian tomahawk, and he stuffed it into his weapon. "All right, lads," said Captain Sheridan, but the words were darkened and muddled by the mask. He lifted it off viciously. "All right, lads, listen to me. Look, we can hold this now. We can. I want you to make sure you're well masked up. Check each other's masks, lads, and just let the foul stuff go over. Don't take off your fucking mask for any reason. The gas will fall in on us here and just sit for a long while. There may be a lousy attack following it. That's the important thing. And lads, for the love of God, don't let the bastards get any further than this very spot in Belgium. You're to crucify the cunts now, men, if you don't mind." And that was not a bad speech for Willie done. It was a pity that the captain's voice trembled so, but you had to say something to fellas in this predicament. 3 men up stood Quigley, who had come up only this very morning, arriving in with a few other lads. Quigley was a tall, gangly lad from the city. He had never seen a real trench in his life, let alone been expected to withstand some kind of assault that he could not fathom the nature of. He was having grave difficulty with the straps of his mask and was muttering and staggering about, a big, clear, dark stain of piss showed now in his breeches front. And Willie was